From the 5th chapter of Joshua. While the people of Israel were encamped in Gilgal, they kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month, at evening in the plains of Jericho. And on the morrow after the Passover, on that very day, they ate of the produce of the land, unleavened cakes and parched grain. And the manna ceased on the morrow. When they ate of the produce of the land, and the people of Israel had manna no more, but ate of the fruit of the land of Canaan that year. Put this here. So if you want the story so far, we've had the Exodus, we've had 40 years in the desert. Moses goes up on the mountain, gets the law. 40 years later, he goes up on the other mountain and is seen no more. And Joshua leads the people across the river into Canaan. They celebrate Passover. The manna stops the next day. Why? Because things changed. I recently watched the movie Ordinary People again for the first time in mumble years, and was reminded how I fell in love with Pachelbel's canon in the first place, because it is one of the primary musical themes in that film. In fact, it is the primary musical theme in that film. It's a very difficult movie to watch. I mean, basically you're watching a family come apart at the seams after the loss of a son. What I also saw was the seed of how I view Pachelbel's canon, or Pachelbel's greatest hit, if you will. It's in terms of the relationship between the steady repetition of the chord progression and the ever-changing nature of the variations, which are all built on that same simple chord progression. If you want to go Aristotelian, it's the essence versus the accidents. Or you could call it eternity versus time, or constancy versus change. We in this meeting have changes coming long term. We are in the middle of these changes. And we're going to have a meeting this coming Saturday at 10 o'clock to discuss some of these changes. How many of you have ever heard of a threshing meeting? Oh, I'm impressed.
I went to a Quaker school.
Oh, which one?
Carolina.
Oh, Carolina, okay. A threshing meeting might or might not come up with an outcome. And in fact, working to the outcome is not the point. The point is to help clarify where we stand. Carolyn has given us 3 queries to ponder beforehand. So I hope that everyone who can possibly be there is there, and for one thing, and I hope that we will look at those queries, live with those queries during the week. As we get ready for this particular threshing meeting, many of you will also have seen Shakespeare in Love. And one of my favorite scenes in that film is where Geoffrey Rush is trying to talk a rich investor into investing into this play that Shakespeare is having a bit of trouble writing. He starts off thinking it will be Romeo and Ethel, the pirate's daughter. And Rush is drawing the fellow in on every step of it, and he confesses at every turn you are threatened with disaster, utter chaos, and somehow it works. Nobody knows how, but it works. And the man eventually becomes the apothecary in what we know as Romeo and Juliet, and sees that in spite of everything, it does work. Quaker meetings, especially Quaker business meetings, or even Quaker threshing meetings, are like that. It's sort of like Jesus to Nicodemus, the wind blows where it will. You can see the evidence of its passing, but you don't know where it's coming from or where it's going. And so it is with the Spirit. And another passage that Quakers are very fond of is, of course, Elijah on the mountain. And we love the part about what traditionally, at least in the King James Version, is translated as the still small voice. What we don't bother to think about very often is that Elijah was given 3 commissions. Scott probably remembers what they were, but I'll tell you what they were. First he was to anoint Hazael as king over Damascus. Then he was to anoint Jehu ben Nimshi as king over Israel. And thirdly, he was to anoint Elisha ben Imlah of Abel Beth Meholah to succeed him. How many of those things did he actually get round to? Just the one, just the last one. And Elisha stage managed the other 2. Quaker decision-making process takes a long time sometimes. The most famous example, of course, is it took us 88 years in this country. From 1688, when Germantown Monthly Meeting made the first recorded protest against slavery, until 1776, when North Carolina Yearly Meeting was the last of the American yearly meetings to make slaveholding a disownable offense. And yet we were 87 years ahead of everybody else. And though we split on other issues, slavery was never on the table that way. So as we approach Saturday's threshing meeting, we might be able to move towards only one of those three queries. The joy of Quaker decision making is, of course, well, one of them is that it operates by spiritual discernment. The other one is that although it takes a long time, especially for the big issues, once we move forward, we all move forward together. And it is practically impossible to make us change from what we have learned in the process. But I will leave you with something to remember along the way. Many of you will have heard of the poet Rumi, the Sufi master. This poem is called Unmarked Boxes. Don't grieve. Anything you lose comes round in another form. The child weaned from mother's milk now drinks wine and honey mixed. God's joy moves from unmarked box to unmarked box, from cell to cell, as rainwater down into flower bed, as roses up from ground. Now it looks like a plate of rice and fish. Now a cliff covered with vines. Now a horse being saddled. It hides within these till one day it cracks them open. Part of the self leaves the body when we sleep and changes shape. You might say, last night I was a cypress tree, a small bed of tulips, a field of grapevines. Then the phantasm goes away. You're back in the room. I don't want to make anyone fearful. Hear what's behind what I say. There's the light gold of wheat in the sun and the gold of bread made from that wheat. I have neither. I'm only talking about them. As a town in the desert looks up at stars on a clear night. God's joy moves from unmarked box to unmarked box. And often we don't recognize it until we start opening boxes. Let me leave you with that thought as we center down.